Hi, this is Dr. John Romano, and I'm recording this lecture on the Peloponnesian War and its aftermath for the course History 3522, Greek and Roman History. This war is named after the Peloponnese, this body of land that includes Sparta. Although, as we will soon see, the Peloponnesian War is a war that its heart was a war between Athens and Sparta. But because of their allies, it was a war that really would end up enveloping the entire ancient Greek world. Now, at the outset, this may seem like a strange thing to you that Athens and Sparta were fighting against one another. After all, we had said that the victory against the Persian Empire to the east was largely a result of the cooperation between Athens and Sparta. The relationship between these two great powers of the ancient Greek world, however, would deteriorate considerably after the end of the Persian Wars. And finally, in the mid-5th century, this would become outright hostility, whereas previously there had been something of a Cold War between the two of them. This resulting war, the Peloponnesian War, was a long and bitter war. It lasted for a total of 27 years, and because of the protracted length and destruction that came about as a result of this war, it would end up having a much more negative effect on the Greek world. Socially, politically, it absolutely wreaked havoc upon Greece. And on top of that, specifically for Athens, it would knock Athens from its great economic strength, its great military strength. It would decimate their population, and it would cause a new pessimism that really permeated throughout the ancient Greek world. So, what were the causes of the Peloponnesian War? We think that Sparta viewed Athens' new position as the seat of an empire with considerable disease. On this map, in the all of the places that are in this kind of puke green color are places now that were part of this Athenian empire. This is not to say that Sparta really wanted to be this kind of power that Athens was. For the most part, it had little interest in being an imperial power, and it kept its seat of strength in the neighboring territories that it dominated. However, it did cause Sparta to fear that at one point Athens may actually begin to close in on its territory. And unless they chose to stop Athens at this point, in the future, they would no longer be able to stop them at all. That, in fact, Athens would one day go on to dominate all of ancient Greece. So Sparta, desiring to keep its freedom, decided that it had to fight, and fight now. Now, what I've been discussing are the sort of larger causes behind this war, but there were also more concrete causes that made this war begin the way it did. One of the main points that would come up between Athens and Sparta was a question of their allies. And some people have actually said that whatever the ultimate cause is, it was this more proximate condition of the relationship to their allies that drew the two powers into a war. So, for instance, Athens had been aiding this power in the northwest known as Corcyra. The spelling I gave you on the outline is slightly different from this spelling, but it's the same place. And Sparta had been allied with another of the great Greek powers, cities, Corinth, located here. And the two, Corcyra and Corinth, were actually locked in a battle. And of course, both Athens would aid its ally, and Sparta would aid its ally Corinth. And so, in fact, through their intermediaries, they actually had started fighting. We also see that Athens, in an attempt to begin to knock Sparta down, had actually been proceeding into putting economic sanctions against this Greek city-state Megara, which is directly to their west, which irritated the Spartans. They said they would have no economic dealings with Megara. Here's a coin from Megara. The combination of the Athenians, first of all, aiding aiding Corcyra and taking sanctions against Megara, gave Sparta the pretext to take the first strike against Athens. Sparta began to demand that Athens stop their overreaching in the ancient Greek world. And they actually presented this formally to the Athenians. The Athenians, however, had absolutely no desire to respond to this foreign demand. In particular, the great politician of Athens, Pericles, who is pictured here, was angrily against any sort of outside interference in Athenian affairs. And he really managed to lead the Athenian assembly to shoot down this proposal. The fear after they heard of this result in Sparta began to grow more. While Spartans began to become more afraid, Athenians become ever more indignant at any attempt at political or economic control by the Spartans. To throw them a bone, the Athenians decided to offer a form of arbitration in this complicated affair involving their allies. The problem, though, as far as the Spartans were controlled, that they feared that their allies would actually abandon them if they did not immediately go to war. And the Spartans were particularly in a bad situation because they depended upon the navy of Corinth to go against Athens, which, as we said previously, was primarily a naval power. Even though the Spartans actually had to go back on their oath not to attack the Athenians that they had made previously, they no longer cared. The Spartans decided to create another pretext. They got one of their allies to attack another ally of Athens, at which point and then it was very clear that the war was on. And both sides would have to engineer a strategy to win. Pericles, the great Athenian politician, developed a strategy that, on its face, sounded as if it was a sound one. He recognized that although Sparta was an enormous power on land, they really did not have much of a navy to speak of. What we think Pericles suggested that the Athenians do was to create this, what it referred to as the long walls, these basically impregnable walls that would surround the city center of Athens and would go all the way down to the harbor. What this meant was that the Athenians did not depend upon the area around the walls to feed themselves. And what it also meant was that whenever the Spartan ground forces came to attempt to destroy Athens, they could simply hide behind the walls and wait them out. And at the same time, the Athenians all the while could be making attacks from their ships, from their naval advantage. They could not hit Sparta by sea. It was inaccessible by sea. but they certainly could destroy enough of their allies to make the allies seriously consider whether or not this war was worth it. Whatever you think of this famous strategy, there was a significant downside to what Pericles had suggested. That was, of course, the Athenians had to stay behind their walls and watch as Spartan armies just destroyed everything in the countryside. They, would take all of their food. They would destroy any houses that were outside of the long walls. And this is, of course, exactly what the Spartans did when the war soon started. It was the Spartans' hope that whatever Pericles had suggested and the Athenians would eventually agree to, when they saw all of this destruction in the area around them, they felt that the Athenians would be forced into war, a war that they knew that the Spartans would have the advantage in. But at least in the beginning, there was no forcing. The Athenians allowed the Spartans to go ahead and destroy their countryside, although it certainly must have been something that they did not enjoy watching. The great problem once the war gets underway for Athens is something that was totally unanticipated. A devastating disease broke out in the city in the year 430. In the written sources, we have descriptions of vomiting, diarrhea, sores breaking out on people, thirst, fever. And here's just one example of one of these mass pits that was prepared for people who had died from this disease. And they're really improvised and seemingly hastily buried, but not without any of the formality of normal Athenian burials. Recent DNA tests of some of the remains that we have suggest that the disease that people suffered from in Athens might have been typhoid fever, although this is actually still an open question, and people have suggested several other possible epidemics. The conditions in the city of Athens may have been caused, or at least been made worse, by the fact that so many of those people who had previously lived outside the city had actually come inside the city when the Spartans were ravaging the land. And this meant that people were jammed together in extremely unsanitary conditions. The city of Athens was not meant to hold all of these country dwellers at the same time. And in fact, by the way, it was this event that would end up causing Pericles' death. For a short period of time, this disease, whatever it was, hobbled Athens, and they actually had to temporarily stop naval raids. Some people must also have been disheartened. It seemed all of a sudden that the gods themselves had actually turned against Athens, which was the only way some people could explain this turn of fortune. This woman that you're seeing here is actually this is a reconstruction of one of the people whose remains that we discovered from this great epidemic in Athens. This is what she may have looked like. In spite of this really major blow to Athens, we do think that the Athenians were still resilient, in spite of getting this loss of manpower. The Athenians would go on to win several major naval battles against the allies of Sparta, although they really had too few men at this point for a knockout blow on the other navies. Especially given just how bad it looked for the Athenians at one point. In the year 425 BCE, they had an enormously lucky break. And many people think that this was probably the best chance for peace in the entire war up to this point. And it came on a tiny island off the west coast here of Greece known as Sphacteria. In this battle, the Athenians managed to come upon a small group of Spartans, around 120, and 170 of their allies, who were stranded on this tiny island. Despite the fact that Spartan soldiers had the reputation of never surrendering, because their entire training went against this possibility. At this point, they felt that they had absolutely no choice. The Athenians had basically trapped them on this island, and they faced certain death. At this point, the Spartans decided that rather than lose all these men and continue a war that really had not been going extremely well for them anyway, they offered favorable terms to the Athenians to end the war immediately. It was at this point that the Athenians began to get greedy. Because of the success they had been enjoying in recent years, they felt that they could get even more than these relatively generous terms. And in effect, the Athenian politicians argued that the assembly should reject any offer of peace, and that's exactly what they did. This move would prove to be foolhardy in many ways, which of course we know now. But even almost immediately after it happened, we recognize by the very strong counterattack by the Spartans that it was a bad move to turn down the peace offer. Going against the Spartan avoidance of getting involved in any sort of large-scale attack outside of home, the Spartans decide to make really a very strong campaign in this northern city-state I'm pointing out here, known as Amphipolis, and of some other cities in the northern Aegean. Sorry, this was just an image of some of the captured Spartans. This is the remains of Amphipolis, as you can see them today. This city in particular was important because it was in this region that Athens got a lot of its gold and silver. There were mines located here. On top of that, there was very good timber. And once Sparta took the city, they immediately lost access to all of this material. It was at this point, finally, Spartan Athens were willing to sit down because both of them had been hit hard. And for a period of time, it seemed that peace would finally be successful. The two great powers signed a peace agreement. And each side ended up, in fact, giving up most of the land that it had gained. It looked like it was going to be go back to the status before the battle. The problem here was that this kind of settlement dissatisfied the hardliners on both sides. Both the Spartans and Athenians felt that they could have gotten more out of the war. They could have both scored a decisive victory if things had gone slightly differently. More than anyone else, probably the Greek person who really makes this war a live one again is this man named by Alcibiades. Alcibiades was brash, he was rich, and very well spoken, and but he was from Athens. More than anyone else, Alcibiades was against peace, perhaps in part because he wanted to gain military success for himself. He wanted more political influence. Alcibiades, in part, was able to bring people over to his side in Athens because he was charismatic, he was good-looking, and he actually had been a winner in the Olympics. He won in a chariot race. We think at this point, Alcibiades is basically able to breathe life into starting the war again. And he turned the Athenian assembly against Sparta. And he managed also to have a new Athenian military alliance to help in this war. Alcibiades, this is his most important role, but it's fair to say, too, that he will play a part in the entire rest of the Peloponnesian War, although not on Athens' side. His ambition is such that when he feels he cannot get what he wants from Athens, he decides to betray Athens, and he begins at one point to work for Sparta. And later on in the same war, he actually goes over to Persia as well, which just showed that his ambition knew no bounds. And he managed at one point or another to irritate all of the sides in the war, not least of all because he began to start hitting on some of the wives of the Persian emperor. Although the war was now live again, it really seemed as if nothing had changed. It appeared that largely Athens and Sparta were again at a stalemate, and there seemed like there was nothing in the short run that could be done to break it. It was at this point that Athens made a fateful decision. Athens decided not to attack Sparta or its allies directly at this point. Instead, it created this entirely new kind of operation, sometimes referred to as the Sicilian Expedition. And this is one inscription that, in fact, commemorates this fateful decision. What Athens would do, and you can get some sense of this from this map, is that rather to hit the world of the Aegean at all, they decided instead that they would go to the southern Italian island of Sicily. The plan here was to strengthen their position as a Mediterranean power by taking the island of Sicily, and to have the people on the island as allies, to gain all of the enormous supply of the island, and then to be able to take that, the new men, the new allies, the new material, and then turn it back on the Greek world. And especially, one of their first aims was the polis of Syracuse, which was actually a very prosperous polis. It was also an ally of Sparta. And this was when Alcibiades was still on Athens' side, and we really think that he whips up enthusiasm for the Athenians to go and to do this plan. Anyone looking at this today seems to think that this plan in many ways was a little crazy. The Athenians were optimistic that they could take the entire island, but it was wealthy, the cities were well protected, and really, in many ways, Athens didn't have nearly enough men to seriously threaten the island of Sicily. On top of that, there was a bad omen, which meant a lot to the Greeks, even before the men of Athens would set out to try to take Sicily. Just before the men departed, Hermes, these kind of marble pillars that had the head of the god Hermes and an erect phallus below. These were set up all around the city as guardians of doorways, guardians of boundaries. For whatever reason, and we still do not know why it happened, just before the Athenians set out, they discovered that some of these herms had been mutilated, which, again, people really took as an extremely bad sign from the gods. It led some people into hysteria, even sort of a kind of witch hunt to try to ferret out who could possibly be responsible for this blasphemy. Many people actually decided to blame Alcibiades for this desecration. And in fact, this is what ended up turning Alcibiades initially against Athens. He decided that rather than stand for judgment in the Athenian court, a judgment that he felt might actually go against him, he decided to leave them entirely. And this, of course, gave Sparta insight on what the Athenian plan was. Meanwhile, the Sicilian expedition ended up going poorly. The Athenian fleet would arrive in Sicily. It discovered that the one ally that it did have, that it was depending upon to shoulder burden of the war, part of the burden of the war, actually had very few resources, no matter what they had previously claimed. We also think that the Athenians immediately lost their opportunity upon landing. They easily captured Syracuse's harbor, and by the way, this is a coin of the polis of Syracuse. The obvious next step would have been for the Athenians to attack the city immediately, which, in fact, for reasons that are not entirely clear, they chose to delay. This left an opening for a Spartan commander to get into the city and then to begin to advise the people of Syracuse as how to respond. And of course, this was very good for the morale of the people of Syracuse, that they had held out and that they had a new ally. When the land attack finally took place, in fact, it was the men of Syracuse who tended to do much better. More troublingly for the Athenians, given their reputation as a naval power, the navy of Syracuse actually managed to trap them in to the harbor, and in fact began to pick off their ships, destroying a good portion of their navy. In this situation, there was a desperate attempt by the Athenian survivors to escape overland, but they had no food, they had no water, and they were constantly harassed by a combination of Syracusans and also some men from Sparta that had been sent as allies. The survivors ended up being herded back to the city of Syracuse, and then they were imprisoned in quarries around the city. Altogether, what this represented was a catastrophe. Now, some have estimated that the Athenians lost as many as 40,000 men, and at least half of their fleet had been destroyed. At this point, the city of Athens was virtually undefended, and many of those cities that had once been part of the Athenian alliance simply broke off. You can imagine that although this was a catastrophe for Athens, the Spartans felt that this was their final opportunity to take the city. Sparta sent another large army. They ravaged the land around Athens, even more so than before. Sparta also tried to lure slaves away from Athens and give them their freedom. In spite of all this, again, somehow the Athenians found the will to resist. They still had something of a navy, albeit not one that was half of as impressive as before. And they actually started to tap into some reserve funds they had. to build some new ships. The Athenians even decided to attack some of their rebellious allies as a warning that you could not simply leave the Athenian empire. So what this meant was, ultimately, the Athenian empire was largely intact out of fear. But again, the Peloponnesian War was somehow at a deadlock. Even after all the Athenians had lost, they refused to submit. It was at this point, and it just shows you how in war friends can become allies, and in some cases you end up going to your enemies as allies instead. Sparta decided of all the people to turn to, they went to their great eastern neighbor, the Persian Empire. This was the only way they felt they could build and equip a navy, since Sparta had, of course, never actually been much of a naval power. To gain this navy, Sparta had to, on behalf of Greece really, give up control of the Ionian cities, the cities on the west coast of what today is Turkey. For Sparta, this seemed, they felt this was basically an obvious move. This would bring an end to the war for good. For many in the Greek world, though, you can imagine how badly they took this. They really found it hard to believe that Sparta was turning to the traditional enemies of the Greek world. It led some to say that really, perhaps because of the long years of fighting, Sparta was much more interested in winning for themselves, and they had lost any sight about the idea of liberating Greece, or keeping it free from the Persians. The effect of getting Persians involved immediately had the after effect of allowing now Sparta to successfully go against the Athenian navy. And in fact, they managed to capture nearly all of Athens' fleet. It was at this point the long walls of the city of Athens were torn down. You can see here some of the few remains in place. Some people think that the only reason that Athens was allowed to continue to exist in spite of this major defeat is that Sparta and some of the other Greek powers were afraid that if they completely destroy it, there might actually be a power vacuum in the area, and it would be extremely destabilizing. One of the great problems that Athens faced was not just this humiliating defeat. We also think that the Peloponnesian War had a negative effect on the kind of democracy that the Athenians had now had for some time. As in the course of the war, more than one demagogue would arise, who would manipulate the emotions of the assembly for personal advantage. On top of that, democracy was actually overthrown on 2 separate occasions by smaller groups of citizens who tried to dominate the state. And so, in fact, Athens was actually in the course of the war temporarily an oligarchy rather than a democracy. Worse than that, the Spartans and the Persians installed what they referred to as 30 tyrants at the end of the war. These were men who were a wealthy elite in Athens, and they absolutely despised democracy. Through the most brutal methods, the 30 tyrants suppressed any opposition. They stole from those who had money. They killed their enemies. Even in this dark time, though, this pro-democracy forces ended up creating a resistance movement. And there were many street battles to determine what the political system of Athens would be. Finally, after this long and bloody sort of series of battles, the winner was democracy. And democracy was actually reestablished in Athens. An amnesty went out to any sort of actions that had happened within the city of Athens during the war, so as not to re-examine that past. And this democracy in Athens would actually persist until finally Alexander the Great would end up conquering Athens. Now, it may seemingly be ending this on a positive note, but in spite of re-winning its democracy, most people think that the Peloponnesian War was a disaster for Athens. Its finances had been shattered. Its military strength now was only a small fraction of what it had been. We also think that people in society were very divided and had trouble making sense of how Athens had gone from being such a great empire to really a second-rate power in a generation. Many people's livelihoods had also been destroyed by the war. Of course, and that are those people who managed to actually survive the war, which was not everyone. Some women who ended up losing their husband were forced to seek work outside of the home, which is not something that previously a upper-class Greek woman was supposed to do. If you lived in the countryside around Athens, for the most part, you lost all of your belongings. You certainly lost your home. We think that in many cases it took a long time to actually restart agriculture around Athens. On top of this, we think that part of the war deaths probably disproportionately fell upon on the lower class, since there really was very little else they seemingly could do during the war, and that actually occurred after the war. In many cases, people do not return to their farms. They just continue to fight. On top of these other things, we had said previously that Athens loses its precious metals. With its economic fortune really being ebbed away, we also think that Athens could no longer survive the great buildings it once had. And all those festivals in honor of gods that produced so much literature, well, that had to be ceased as well. We think that for a brief period, Sparta was actually an ascendancy in the Greek world. And we think that the Spartans tried to exploit their victory and try themselves now to do what Athens had done, which was to dominate the Aegean world. It was unfortunate, though, that Sparta had no strong cultural or religious links with the other Greek city-states. They really saw the Spartans as a group of brutes, and they questioned how loyal they were to the Greek cause. Spartans also end up losing one of their main allies, the Persians, who no longer have any use for them. And what ends up happening as a result of this is many of those powers who had been even allied with Sparta previously decided that they no longer needed this or wanted this alliance anymore. And in fact, some of Sparta's previous allies would end up destroying the Spartan fleet. It was in this situation where it was difficult to tell who was allied with whom, that, believe it or not, some of the Greek city-states who had been formerly freed from the Athenian alliance would actually now willingly, voluntarily submit themselves to Athenian power. And this pillar is one of those signs that of these sort of new alliances with Athens that were forming. Perhaps the greatest sign of these sort of this changed conditions in the Greek world was when a city-state we have not given much attention to, but one that had a good deal of money from shipbuilding, for instance, the polis of Thebes, which is located here, ends up actually becoming the dominant military power in the Greek world. The Athenians no longer had the strength to stand against Sparta. Thebes, however, did. They ended up creating an alliance with some other Greek powers, and against all belief, they end up smashing the Spartan army in battle and reducing it to a second-rate power. The Spartans would no longer be dominant in the Greek world at all. And you can see here in the map the end result of all this. That sort of yellowish color are all these powers now that are allied to Thebes. The darker green are those places that are still allied to Athens. This other sort of mustardish color was those places that were still allied to Sparta. And then the rest are just independent states. Especially with this war between Thebes and Sparta, in many cases, Thebes actually uses a much lighter form of armor than the traditional hoplite armor, which is no longer as favored. The end result of all of this war was the Greek world was utterly weak. It was exhausted from this long, difficult war. The great powers that we had spoken about, Athens and Sparta, were absolutely shattered. Many of the other Greek communities were equally battered by war. Everyone realized the dangers of outside control, someone coming in now and potentially smashing the Greek world. It's also fair to say that Athens was not the only place that had civil, political unrest as a result of the looming threat of war. We also see that in many cases, the Greek cities don't even provide enough money from people to actually live. And we see this growing population of homeless Greek people who end up migrating through the Greek world. Some Greeks actually end up hiring themselves out as mercenaries, even actually to the Persians, in order to sustain themselves. As we're going to see very shortly in coming lectures, this was a situation in which the Greek world was ripe to be conquered by the right power. And we're going to see in Alexander the Great, and again the war that he starts from Macedon here in the north is exactly that war. But Alexander would never have been able to conquer the Greek world as easily as he did if the Greeks themselves hadn't so thoroughly destroyed themselves in the course of the Peloponnesian War. Thank you. That's the end of the lecture, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.